Thank you for having me on the show. It is actually very unfortunate that violence has erupted now in the protests. So far, the weeks-long protests didn't see much violence, but what we saw yesterday was the first death of a protester. And already the government has promised an investigation, and we're yet to see really what happens. But it was very, very worrying to see the violence erupt, not just in that particular site. There's now been reports of several other places. So it's to be seen how this violence kind of is controlled and how the authorities respond and how the protesters take it forward. Because as I said before, it's been peaceful protests calling for change. And now it's a very different situation on the ground in Sri Lanka.
Yes, it is. And, at the same time, Gotabaya Rajapaksa has now tried to win over protesters by announcing a new cabinet. Even some of his own family members have lost their positions. But this kind of situation is not going to reassure Sri Lankans. I can imagine that the situation is going to improve.
Yes, I think the government seems to be quite desperate to appease the protesters. The call has been very loud and clear for the president to go home, for the Rajapaksas to go home. And that the pressure led to mass resignation on the 3rd of April, which included resignations of some of the Rajapaksas. But the president and the prime minister remain in office, and the protesters continue to call for their resignation. So the new cabinet does not have, or those who were sworn in this week, there are no family members. But the calls for the president and prime minister continue. So it's a bit of a stalemate in terms of where do we go next. But the violence really and the fatality really does have an impact. And the worry really is how far would the protesters be able to carry on peacefully in the present developments?
Yeah. At the same time, talks have begun with the IMF. They've acknowledged the country needs to make its debt sustainable before receiving any more funds. How is this government going to go about trying to reassure the international community that they can get things back on track?
Well, this is the thing. The violence actually erupted while the government is in talks with the IMF in DC. And that also shows that while they want to project this picture that they're in control, really how in control are they in Sri Lanka? But the IMF talks also shows that deep structural reforms are needed in Sri Lanka. And we're yet to see a plan within Sri Lanka that the government has shared as to how they're going to take this forward. So it's very early days in terms of the IMF talks. But, I think it's also, we are in such a crisis that any international assistance to address this crisis is necessary. So, in a way, we need the assistance, but how is that going to be dealt with is the big question. And then all these violent incidences that's happening in the last 24 hours is also raising concerns. So, since we last spoke, I think we've got into a worse situation in terms of the stability of the country, but really no real long-term solutions yet unveiled by this government.
Has there been much progress from the opposition players in terms of trying to come up with some sort of alternative?
So we are at the moment this week, Parliament is in session. The opposition has promised they're going to bring in a no confidence motion. They're going to bring in an amendment to abolish the executive presidency. So, if these things move, I think that would also show that the opposition has some things in play, but these have yet to be presented in Parliament. So again, this seems a lot of talk by both the government and the opposition. And I think we really need to see action now, genuine action that addresses the calls of the protesters. And we haven't seen that even from the opposition.
Last week, Sri Lanka temporarily defaulted on its foreign debt. basically just not having the money to pay for it, trying to focus on what's really essential in the country. What kind of repercussions do you think this could have?
Well, I think if you look at the last couple of months, the economic, those who are very much following the economic issues have been calling for the need for a planned default because we are in such a crisis, and continue to pay debts is not going to help with much needed essential items, including medicine. So this was, I think, a necessary step. And that actually starts a process as to see how does one bring in the medicines, essential goods, the fuel, the gas, all of that that's needed. And remember, the protests that have happened are linked to this scarcity of essential items. So, I think it's a necessary measure. It's a bit too late in the day. This should have happened before, but at least we seem to be going in the right direction. But again, it's not just one measure that's needed, it's a much more longer term plan that's required. So one hopes the new finance minister, the central bank governor, and others who are now taking charge will actually have a communication strategy to show what they're going to be doing in Sri Lanka and also to the international community.
Bhavani, really good to get your perspective on this. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.